You were not raised by softness. You were shaped by calculation. Long before you learned the language of self-expression, you learned the language of consequence. Approval was not freely given. Affection was measured. Silence carried weight. And behind that silence stood a generation that understood something brutal about the world. Mercy without strength invites exploitation. Generation X parents did not announce their philosophy. They embodied it. They did not preach power. They demonstrated hierarchy. Their discipline was not theatrical. It was structural. They were raised in economic uncertainty, cultural transition, and institutional distrust. They learned early that survival belongs to the vigilant, and so they raised you accordingly. At first glance it appeared rigid, at times even cold. Nay, but beneath the surface was a calculated realism. They did not promise the world would be kind. They prepared you for the certainty that it would not. This is the core Machiavellian principle they lived by, whether consciously or not. Control perception, control outcome. They understood that children test boundaries not because they are evil, but because they are discovering leverage. A child learns quickly which emotions move the parent. Tears, anger, withdrawal. Generation X. Parents recognize this instinctively, and they refuse to be emotionally manipulated. They did not reward hysteria. They did not negotiate under emotional pressure. When you pushed, they held their ground. When you dramatized, they withdrew reinforcement. What you interpreted as indifference was strategic detachment. Machiavelli wrote that it is safer to be feared than loved if one cannot be both. Generation X. Parents did not aim for fear as cruelty. They aimed for respect as inevitability. They understood that authority diluted by inconsistency breeds contempt. Their discipline was rarely explosive. It was deliberate. A quiet look across the room, a measured tone that signaled finality. Consequences delivered without debate. No emotional spectacle, only structure. You learned something essential in those moments. Power does not shout. It does not justify itself. It does not chase validation. It remains steady, and this steadiness created psychological tension. You did not always feel understood. You did not always feel emotionally accommodated. But you felt the boundaries, and boundaries create clarity. Clarity breeds strength. Generation X parenting was not about emotional indulgence. It was about environmental realism. They had seen institutions fail. They had seen loyalty betrayed. They had watched narratives shift overnight. Trust in their world was not blind. It was earned and monitored. They raised you with the same lens. Do not reveal everything. Do not trust immediately. Do not expect fairness. Prepare for resistance. Anticipate disappointment. Remain self-reliant. These were not lectures. They were atmospheres. You absorbed them through tone, through reaction, through what was rewarded and what was ignored. When you succeeded quietly, they nodded. When you complained loudly, they corrected. Achievement was respected. Excuses were dismantled. And beneath this method was an unspoken belief. The world respects competence, not vulnerability. This is where the Machiavellian alignment becomes clear. Machiavelli did not advocate cruelty. He advocated realism. He warned leaders against the illusion that good intentions guarantee good outcomes. Generation X. Parents internalized this instinctively. They understood that shielding a child from discomfort weakens the child's future leverage. So they allowed frustration. They allowed boredom. They allowed failure. They did not rush to rescue. That restraint was not neglect, it was strategy. Because resilience is not taught through reassurance. It is forged through controlled exposure. And here lies the uncomfortable truth. Many resented them for it. You may have labeled them emotionally distant. You may have wished for more softness, more affirmation, more visible warmth. But softness without structure produces fragility. They were not raising you for applause. They were raising you for endurance. Endurance is power extended over time. They valued privacy. Personal matters stayed within the home. Weakness was not displayed publicly. Emotional outbursts were handled behind closed doors. Image mattered. Reputation mattered. Perception mattered. They understood something many overlook. Once perception slips, authority erodes. In social settings, they maintained composure. They did not reveal family conflict to outsiders. They preserved the hierarchy of the household. You learned to read rooms. You learned to adjust your behavior according to context. Adaptation became second nature, and adaptation is survival intelligence. Generation X parents did not aim to be your friends. While friendship implies equality, they maintained positional superiority, not to dominate, but to guide. They believed authority must be visible to be effective. They were not emotionally transparent. They were emotionally disciplined. There is a difference. Transparency seeks understanding. Discipline commands respect. Through them, you learned that emotions are internal weather. They pass. They are observed. They are controlled before they are expressed. Anger was rarely impulsive. Punishment was rarely random. Decisions were calculated. This created psychological gravity. You knew when they were serious. You felt the weight before the words were spoken, and that weight shaped your nervous system. It trained you to anticipate consequence, to consider action before impulse. Many modern observers call this strict, or some call it harsh. But examine the outcome: self-reliance, emotional restraint, strategic thinking. These are not accidental traits. They are cultivated under firm architecture. Generation X parents believed that comfort is earned, not guaranteed. Gratitude was expected. Entitlement was confronted. Complaints were dissected. If you wanted something, you worked for it. If you failed, you adjusted. Excuses had no oxygen in that environment. And in this atmosphere, a subtle psychological upgrade occurred. You began to monitor yourself. You learned to regulate behavior before correction arrived. Internal discipline replaced external enforcement. This is the ultimate Machiavellian victory. When authority no longer needs to intervene because the subject has internalized the structure. They did not need constant surveillance. Their standards lingered in your mind. Even in their absence, you asked yourself what would be acceptable. That is influence at its highest level. They were not perfect. No strategist is flawless. Sometimes their detachment bordered on emotional scarcity. Sometimes their refusal to indulge feelings left silent wounds. But even this carried a lesson. Life does not guarantee emotional closure. You learn to process pain independently. You learn to sit with discomfort without immediate relief. That endurance hardened you, not into cruelty, into composure. Composure under pressure is rare, and rare traits command advantage. Generation X. Parents understood that the world does not slow down for your feelings. They did not say it softly. They demonstrated it repeatedly. Bills had to be paid. Responsibilities had to be met. Schedules were honored. Duty before desire. This hierarchy shaped your internal compass. You may have resisted it. You may have misunderstood it. But over time, you began to see the pattern. Emotional indulgence weakens negotiation power. Composure strengthens it. They were training negotiators of reality. They did not celebrate mediocrity. They did not cushion failure with excessive praise. Praise was selective, earned, specific, and this selectivity increased its value. When approval finally arrived, it carried weight. It was not casual encouragement. It was recognition. Recognition from a disciplined authority embeds deeply. It programs ambition. They were not performing parenthood for social validation. They were executing it as responsibility. And that difference is critical. Performance seeks applause. Responsibility seeks outcome. The outcome they pursued was not popularity. It was capability. Capability survives. And beneath every strict boundary was an unspoken fear. The world will test you without mercy. Better to be tested here, where consequence is controlled, than later, where consequence is irreversible. This is the harsh love of strategists. They may not have articulated it in philosophical language, but their behavior mirrored ancient political realism. Control emotion, guard image, anticipate betrayal, reward strength, correct weakness, maintain hierarchy. The household was a microstate, and they ruled it accordingly. Some children broke under this structure. Others adapted and sharpened. The difference lay not in the parent alone, but in the child's capacity to interpret discipline as preparation rather than rejection. Those who interpreted it as preparation developed an edge. They learned that authority can be firm without being chaotic, that leadership is not volume, but consistency, that respect is preserved through boundaries. This is the psychological inheritance of Generation X parenting. It is not sentimental. It is strategic. And if you carry its imprint, you carry both its scars and its strengths. The question is no longer whether it was fair. Fairness is a comforting illusion. The question is whether it prepared you. Because preparation is the only currency that compounds over time. Chapter 2, 3, and 4 await your command. They did not always say, "I am proud of you," and that silence carved something into you. And affection was not absent. It was rationed. Approval was not constant. It was conditional. You felt it in small doses, often after performance, rarely before it. And in that scarcity, a quiet hunger formed. Generation X. Parents understood something unsettling. What is always available is rarely respected. So they withheld excess validation. Not as cruelty, but as calibration. They knew the world would not applaud your effort. It would measure your results. And so they trained you to chase competence, not comfort. When you brought home achievement, they nodded with restrained acknowledgement. When you stumbled, they did not collapse into panic. They did not overcorrect with emotional rescue. Instead, they observed. They waited to see how you would respond, because in their philosophy, reaction reveals character. Yet you may have felt unseen in moments when you wanted softness. You may have mistaken composure for indifference. But beneath that composed exterior was a disciplined belief. Emotion unmanaged becomes liability. Machiavellian psychology does not reject emotion. It masters it. Generation X. Parents rarely erupted without purpose. When they were disappointed, it was measured. When they were angry, it was controlled. And when they were silent, it was intentional. Silence was not emptiness. It was pressure. You learned quickly that their silence carried consequence. It forced introspection. It made you confront your own behavior without immediate emotional cushioning. In that space, discomfort grew. Discomfort is an instructor without mercy, and they allowed it to teach you. Our modern language would call this emotional distance, but distance creates perspective. When a parent does not immediately rush to soothe every distress, the child must regulate internally. Breath slows, thoughts reorganize, responsibility surfaces, self-regulation begins. Generation X. Parents were not emotionally expressive in public. They did not dramatize affection. They did not narrate their feelings in detail. Vulnerability was private, sometimes nearly invisible. You grew up reading microsignals, a slight shift in tone, a tightened jaw, a pause before a response. You developed perceptual awareness because survival within hierarchy requires sensitivity. You became observant. Observation is power. They did not encourage emotional chaos. Tears did not automatically produce negotiation. Anger did not earn leverage. Yeah, you could express feeling, but it would not override structure. This taught you a severe but valuable lesson. Emotion does not excuse consequence. And so you learned to separate feeling from action. You felt disappointment, but you still completed the task. You felt fear, but you still faced the requirement. You felt resentment, but you still respected the boundary. This separation forged control. Inside you, however, another process unfolded. A quiet internal dialogue formed. If approval is scarce, I must earn it. If praise is rare, I must exceed expectation. If warmth is measured, I must become worthy of it. Ambition sharpened. Generation X. Parents rarely inflated your ego. They corrected it. They challenged entitlement. They dismantled self-pity with blunt realism. If something went wrong, well, they asked what you could have done differently. Responsibility returned to you. At times, this felt heavy. You may have wished for someone to simply agree that life was unfair, but they resisted that narrative. They knew that chronic victimhood erodes agency. They were training you to reclaim leverage. In their worldview, weakness advertised vulnerability, and vulnerability invited exploitation. They had seen it in workplaces, in institutions, in fractured communities. They carried that memory into their parenting, so they hardened you, not by constant harshness, but by consistent expectation. They expected you to handle discomfort. They expected you to control your tone. They expected you to understand that respect flows upward before it flows downward. Hierarchy was not debated. It was assumed. Oh, within that structure you developed dual awareness. Outwardly, you complied. Inwardly, you analyzed. You began to understand that power does not always explain itself. It asserts and observes. You watched them negotiate with the world. You saw how they spoke differently to authority figures, to strangers, to family. You noticed restraint in certain environments, dominance in others. Adaptation again, but now layered with emotional calculation. Generation X parents did not overshare their fears with you. Financial stress was often concealed. Personal anxieties were filtered. They carried burdens quietly. This silence taught another lesson. Strength is not loud suffering. It is composed endurance. You internalize that composure equals maturity. Yet emotional scarcity has consequence. When warmth is limited, there the child becomes self-sufficient in affection. You may have learned to soothe yourself, to celebrate privately, to endure heartbreak without spectacle, to process confusion alone. Independence deepened, but so did guardedness. Machiavellian psychology recognizes this dual edge. Detachment increases resilience, yet it can restrict intimacy. Generation X parents prioritized resilience. They assumed closeness would follow strength. They believed stability must precede softness. Whether they were correct is not the focus. The result is, you emerged less easily impressed, less easily destabilized. Praise from strangers does not intoxicate you quickly. Criticism does not immediately collapse you. You have been conditioned by higher standards. Standards shape identity. Because approval was selective, But you became selective with your own validation. You do not admire mediocrity. You do not reward minimal effort in yourself. You measure quietly. Measurement is internal authority. At times you may feel emotionally reserved. Others may label you distant. But beneath that reserve is calibration. You do not expose your interior without assessment. You do not trust instantly. You evaluate. This is inherited vigilance. Generation X parents did not explicitly teach you suspicion. They modeled discernment. Trust was earned slowly. Loyalty was observed over time. Betrayal, once discovered, was rarely forgiven easily. You absorbed that code. And so your relationships are deliberate, your commitments cautious, your respect conditional on consistency. Emotional scarcity also intensified your reaction to genuine acknowledgement. When someone recognizes your effort with sincerity, it penetrates deeply, because you were trained to value rare affirmation. Scarcity increases value. This principle governed their parenting more than you realized. They limited material indulgence as well. Not every desire was fulfilled. You learned to wait, to save, to prioritize. Gratification delayed strengthens will. Willpower is leverage against impulse. You may not have thanked them for that discipline. You may have resisted it fiercely. But the adult you are becoming operates with endurance others lack. You can sit in discomfort longer. You can delay reaction. You can analyze before responding. This is emotional strategy. Generation X. Parents did not speak the language of therapy. They spoke the language of consequence. They did not dissect every feeling. They assessed behavior. Behavior determines outcome. From them, you learned that feelings matter privately, but actions matter publicly. And public outcome shapes reputation. Reputation is long memory. They guarded theirs carefully, and they expected you to guard yours. When you embarrassed the family, correction was swift. Not because they valued image superficially, but because they understood that perception once damaged spreads quickly. Social capital is fragile. You learn to think before speaking, to consider long-term impact, to restrain impulse for strategic advantage. This restraint now feels natural to you, and yet there is an internal intensity beneath it. Because emotional scarcity creates depth, you feel strongly. You simply do not display it recklessly. You love deeply. You simply do not announce it carelessly. You are loyal, but only after evaluation. This is not coldness. It is calibration. Generation X parents forged individuals who can operate without constant reassurance. Individuals who do not collapse when applause disappears. Individuals who understand that validation from the world is unstable. Stability must be internal. This is the hidden inheritance. It did not arrive wrapped in softness. It arrived wrapped in expectation. And expectation, when consistently enforced, builds architecture within the mind. You now carry that architecture. The walls may feel rigid at times, the standards heavy, but within those walls exists something rare: control over your emotional expression. Control is not suppression, it is selection. You choose when to reveal. You choose when to respond. You choose when to detach. This capacity was not accidental. It was forged in an environment where love existed, but strength was prioritized. And whether you fully approve of their method or not, the result is undeniable. You are difficult to break. Continue when ready for the next chapter. Before you understood influence, you understood image. Generation X parents rarely explained this directly. They demonstrated it with precision. In public, composure was law. Disagreement was postponed. Correction was delayed until privacy returned. The household could fracture internally, but externally it remained intact. You learned early that perception is a shield. Machiavelli warned that a ruler must appear virtuous, even when strategy demands otherwise. Generation X. Parents lived a domestic version of this principle. They did not expose weakness casually. They did not advertise conflict. They understood that once authority appears unstable, control weakens, so they maintained form. At gatherings, their tone was measured, their posture steady, their responses controlled. If tension existed, it was invisible. You watched this performance not as deception, but as discipline. Discipline of presentation. And you absorbed it. You began to understand that authenticity without restraint is vulnerability. That transparency without timing is self-sabotage. That the world does not reward uncontrolled exposure. This was your first education in social power. They taught you, without lectures, that reputation compounds. One reckless display can undo years of quiet credibility. One uncontrolled outburst can redefine how others categorize you. Categorization determines opportunity, so they insisted on standards, not because they feared judgment irrationally, but because they understood consequence mathematically. Human beings make decisions based on impressions. Impressions shape access. Access is leverage. When you spoke out of turn, correction came swiftly. When you embarrassed the household, the response was not emotional chaos. It was cold clarity. You were reminded that your behavior reflects beyond yourself. Individual action affects collective standing. This awareness matured you quickly. While others operated impulsively, you scanned environments. You assessed tone before speaking. You noticed power dynamics in rooms where others noticed only noise. You learned to observe hierarchy. Who commands attention without raising their voice, who negotiates subtly, who dominates through silence. You saw these patterns because your home was structured around them. Generation X parents did not beg for respect. They assumed it and enforced it. If it was violated, consequences followed. Not theatrically, strategically. You witnessed cause and effect repeatedly. From this, a crucial understanding formed. Authority is not sustained by volume. It is sustained by consistency and boundary. Boundary is the architecture of power. They did not over-explain their decisions. Explanations were brief, sometimes minimal. Because I said so was not intellectual laziness. It was reinforcement of position. Position does not negotiate every demand. As a child, this may have felt suffocating. As an adult, you recognize the psychological lesson. Not every decision requires consensus. Leadership is not democracy within hierarchy. This realization separates the reactive from the strategic. Generation X parents also modeled controlled vulnerability. Rarely did you see them collapse under stress. Even when pressure was visible, they functioned. Bills were paid. Responsibilities met. Appearances maintained. Function before feeling. This sequence programmed you. Now, when crisis emerges, you do not dissolve immediately into emotion. You stabilize first. You handle logistics. You contain reaction. Only later do you process internally. This is not emotional absence. It is emotional sequencing. Machiavellian psychology emphasizes timing. Emotion expressed at the wrong time weakens position. Emotion expressed deliberately can strengthen influence. You learned timing without reading theory. When your parents were disappointed, they did not always react instantly. Sometimes the response came hours later, measured and calm. That delay amplified its impact. You had time to anticipate, to reflect, to feel tension build. Anticipation magnifies consequence. You internalize that lesson. Now you understand the power of pause. You understand that silence can shift balance more effectively than immediate reaction. Silence forces others to fill the space. It reveals insecurity. It exposes overcompensation. Generation X. Parenting refined your tolerance for silence. There were moments in your home when words were unnecessary. A look communicated expectation. A posture communicated warning. A pause communicated disapproval. You became fluent in nonverbal authority. This fluency grants advantage in adult interactions. While others rely on excessive explanation, you rely on calibrated presence. You do not need to announce boundaries loudly. You project them subtly. Subtle power lasts longer. They also taught you the danger of oversharing. Personal matters were contained. Financial details were guarded. Family conflicts were not public entertainment. Privacy was not secrecy. It was protection. Protection of leverage. Because once others understand your weaknesses intimately, they can exploit them. Generation X. Parents carried this belief deeply. They had witnessed social shifts, economic instability, institutional betrayals. Trust was never naive. You inherited caution. This caution does not mean paranoia. It means discernment. You do not reveal your full strategy prematurely. You do not disclose ambitions to those who have not proven loyalty. Ambition exposed too early attracts resistance. Your parents may never have articulated this, but they embodied it. They shared selectively. They trusted slowly. They forgave carefully. From them, you learned that forgiveness without memory invites repetition. So, you developed internal records. You remember patterns. You note inconsistencies. You adjust access accordingly. Access is privilege, not entitlement. Generation X. Parents also demonstrated emotional containment during conflict. They did not always explode when challenged. Sometimes they simply withdrew warmth. Communication shortened. Privileges reduced. Power reduced without drama. This response taught you that dominance does not require spectacle. It requires control over resources, time, attention, approval. When these are withdrawn strategically, behavior shifts. You now understand leverage in relationships. You understand that constant availability reduces value, that controlled distance increases clarity. This is not manipulation for cruelty. It is regulation of balance. And yet, within this structured education, a deeper transformation occurred. You stopped seeking external chaos for stimulation. You became comfortable with quiet authority. You realized that loud personalities often compensate for fragile control. True power does not advertise itself. Generation X. Parents rarely sought admiration from their children. They sought obedience and development. Love was implied, while not performed excessively. You learned that love does not always announce itself with volume. Sometimes it appears as strictness, sometimes as denial, sometimes as expectation. Expectation, when consistent, is belief in capacity. They believed you could handle more than comfort. They believed you could endure more than ease, and so they treated you accordingly. This treatment elevated you, though it may not have felt gentle. Now, in adulthood, you see social interactions differently. You detect insecurity behind aggression. You detect weakness behind excessive friendliness. You detect ambition behind flattery. Because you were raised in an environment where surface emotion was rarely the full story. You look beyond expression to motive. Motive reveals intent, and intent determines trust. While this perceptual awareness is your inheritance, it can isolate you if misused. It can empower you if disciplined. The difference lies in whether you allow suspicion to dominate or discernment to guide. Generation X. Parents did not aim to create cynics. They aimed to create survivors of social reality. Survival in social reality requires reading power accurately. You now carry that ability. You understand that influence flows quietly, that authority must be protected, that image must be curated, that silence, when intentional, is not weakness, but control. And control over perception is often control over outcome. The education of silence is complete when you no longer fear being misunderstood temporarily, when you no longer rush to correct every false assumption, when you allow time to reveal your consistency. Consistency is the ultimate argument. This is where their philosophy converges with Machiavellian realism. Appear stable, act decisively, reveal selectively, maintain boundary, let reputation precede explanation. These were not lectures. They were lived examples, and you absorbed them in the spaces between words. Continue when you are prepared for the final chapter. There comes a moment when you stop blaming them. Not because every method was gentle, not because every silence was harmless, but because you recognize what was actually built inside you. Generation X. Parents did not raise you to be comfortable. They raised you to be unshaken. And that distinction changes everything. You carry their imprint in the way you respond to pressure. When crisis enters the room, you do not immediately panic. You calculate. When conflict surfaces, you do not dissolve. You assess leverage. When emotion surges, you do not broadcast it. You contain it. This is not repression. It is command. Machiavellian self-mastery begins with the understanding that the greatest territory you will ever govern is internal. If your reactions control you, others will control you through those reactions. If your emotions are predictable, they become tools in someone else's hands. Generation X, parents trained unpredictability out of you. They made consequence consistent. They made standards clear. And in doing so, they forced you to discipline yourself before discipline arrived externally. Now you possess something rare. You can sit in discomfort without demanding immediate relief. You can endure silence without scrambling to fill it. You can face criticism without collapsing into identity crisis. Because your identity was never built on constant applause, it was built on expectation. Expectation forged steel. There is a difference between those raised on affirmation and those raised on structure. Affirmation soothes the ego. Structure fortifies the spine. One feels warmer, the other lasts longer. You were taught to last. Generation X. Parents did not romanticize struggle, but they did not fear it either. They did not interpret hardship as injustice by default. They interpreted it as reality. Reality is not personal. It is indifferent. And when you understand that, you stop wasting energy demanding fairness from a system that operates on power and perception. Instead, you refine yourself. Yet you become harder to manipulate. Flattery does not easily seduce you. Intimidation does not easily silence you. Emotional theatrics do not easily destabilize you, because you were not raised in an environment that rewarded theatrics. You were raised in an environment that rewarded control. Now the question becomes whether you will use that control consciously. Many inherit discipline but never claim it deliberately. They react automatically, shaped by childhood tension but unaware of its design. The transformation occurs when you recognize the architecture and decide to inhabit it fully. Generation X. Parenting was not about dominance for its own sake. It was about preparing you for a world that negotiates ruthlessly. You have seen how quickly respect shifts when weakness is exposed carelessly. Yet you have seen how opportunities disappear when reputation fractures. You have seen how emotional volatility reduces credibility. So you learned restraint. Restraint is not passivity. It is stored force. When you speak now, you can choose precision over impulse. When you act, you can choose strategy over reaction. When you confront, you can do so without losing composure. Composure under confrontation is social power. Your parents may not have used philosophical language. They may not have referenced ancient political theory. Yet their methods mirrored a timeless principle. Control yourself, and you reduce the number of variables others can exploit. Self-control simplifies the battlefield. There were costs. You may struggle to express vulnerability freely. You may hesitate before trusting deeply, where you may hold your emotions with such discipline that others mistake you for distant. But within that restraint lies strength that chaos cannot easily fracture. You are not easily overwhelmed by public opinion. You are not easily seduced by trends. You are not easily destabilized by rejection, because you were conditioned to seek internal approval first. This is the final inheritance: internal authority. When your standards are internal, external pressure weakens. When your validation is internal, external applause loses its intoxicating power. When your discipline is internal, external enforcement becomes unnecessary. You become self-governing, and self-governance is the highest form of power. The Machiavellian psychology embedded in Generation X parenting was never about cruelty, yet it was about survival through awareness. It was about understanding that softness without structure invites collapse. It was about recognizing that love must sometimes arrive disguised as strictness. Now you stand at a threshold. You can either resent the forge or recognize the weapon it produced. You are measured. You are observant. You are capable of silence that unsettles and words that land precisely. You can detach when necessary. You can endure without spectacle. These are not accidental traits. They are engineered. The world you inhabit now is louder, more emotionally expressive, more publicly vulnerable. Yet noise does not equal strength. Exposure does not equal influence. Volume does not equal authority. Authority remains quiet. If you choose, you can refine what was given to you. Keep the discipline. Add conscious empathy. Maintain boundaries, but allow deliberate connection. Use perception strategically, not defensively. Transformation does not require abandoning your foundation. It requires mastering it. You were raised to understand consequence. Now understand intention. You were raised to respect hierarchy. Now command yourself. You were raised to guard perception. Now shape it deliberately. This is not rebellion against your upbringing. It is its completion. The final evolution of Generation X discipline is conscious self-mastery. Not coldness, not rigidity, but controlled power guided by awareness. You do not need to announce your strength. You do not need to justify your composure. You do not need to perform your resilience. You simply embody it. Stand firm in your restraint. Yet refine your perception. Govern your emotion before it governs you. And remember this final law. The one who masters their internal world cannot be ruled by the external one.